Nicole via Instagram through DM wrote monotone voice, flat affect, etc. My husband is like this always. Autism also displays these characteristics. I have 2 kids with Asperger's. What is the correlation, please? Is he autistic or just constantly down the ladder? That's the first part. I'm going to say the second part. So I'm just going to respond to this for now. I have no idea. I have no idea if your husband would fall on the autism spectrum, and that would be wildly inappropriate for me to diagnose or give my thoughts on him in particular. So again, just kind of speaking generally here, there is potentially a polyvagal connection to autism or to the autism spectrum, potentially. And this is something that Porges has written on. I'll link to an essay that he wrote or a paper he wrote in the description, but I'm going to read directly from that to kind of give us an idea here. And I don't consider myself an autism expert whatsoever. I have a very light understanding of it. Like, you'd be surprised when it comes to therapy school, people often say, well, don't you learn in depth about trauma and polyvagal theory and whatnot? And the answer is no. And likewise, we get some education on the autism spectrum, but not a whole lot, in my opinion. A lot of the stuff is like what we learn after schooling, or at least my experience. Okay, so Porges has written on this, and here's a direct quote. He says, observations of the behaviors and physiologic response of autistic individuals suggest that they have great difficulties in recruiting the neural circuit that regulates the social engagement system. And so that's one part, but on top of that, he says, because the vagus is integrated into several feedback systems involving both peripheral and central structures, depression or dysregulation of the vagus might be manifested on several levels. So let me quickly interpret that as best I can here. The first part of that, he's saying that basically saying that autistic individuals potentially could have basically a difficult time accessing their ventral vagal, their safety state. That's basically what he's saying. And then the second part of what he's saying is that the vagus is connected to so many things that if there is some dysregulation via the vagus, through the vagus, then we would see dysregulation in different in different aspects of someone who's on the autism spectrum, which I'm going to go into in a little bit here. So not just social, and usually I think a lot of times we associate autism spectrum with the sociability aspect of it, but there is potentially much more. So basically, someone in a state of defense has less access to their safety state, and this is a non-spectrum individual. They have less access to their safety state. Me, you, anybody. If we're in a state of defense, if we're down our polyvagal ladder, we simply have less access to our safety state, which is potentially very similar for someone with autism, but the potential for self-regulation seems to be different. And again, I'm not an expert, but there seems to be a big difference in the potentiality for self-regulation, for climbing our own ladder on our own. So someone can become in a defensive state just day to day, someone who's not on the spectrum, but they can get back up to their safety state. They can self-regulate through whatever it is, or even receive co-regulation. And it's really not a big deal. Someone who is on the autism spectrum simply has less access to their safety state. It seems like chronically. And it's not just that, so it's not just an issue of not being able to socialize. The safety state is not just for socialization and like social engagement, but that's where critical thinking happens. That's where health and growth and restoration happens. A lot of things come along with being in our ventral vagal state of safety and social engagement. It's not just about social engagement. So a lot of things come along with that. But that's the similarities, that someone in a state of defense has less access to their safety state. Similarly, someone on the autism spectrum seems like has less access to their safety state, or that's what Porges is arguing. That's the connection. But it obviously is not that simple either. So autism in particular will have other characteristics that are not necessarily part of a typical down the ladder individual. So we have to kind of differentiate what these could look like. I got this from autismspeaks.org, and I'll put a link in the description to an article called "What Are Symptoms?" or "What Are the Symptoms of Autism?" I believe, but I'll have a link in the description. So people with autism not only have the social engagement difficulties, but they also might have challenges with spoken language. And again, this is directly from that website. It says a third of autistic people are nonverbal. Someone who's in a defensive state, even a stuck defensive state, that's not on the spectrum, isn't necessarily going to have issues with their ability to utilize language. Someone with autism may have repetitive body movements, for example, rocking, flapping, spinning, running back and forth. Someone on the spectrum may have repetitive motions with objects, like spinning wheels, shaking sticks, flipping levers. Somebody on the spectrum may have behaviors of staring at lights or spinning objects. They may have ritualistic behaviors, like lining up objects, repeatedly touching objects in a set order. This individual may have narrow or extreme interests in specific topics. They may have a need for unvarying routine and resistance to change. For example, the same daily schedule, meal menu, clothes, the same route to school. And they may also have sensory issues like being over or under sensitive to sensory stimuli like lights. So these are not necessarily aspects of someone who's in a stuck defensive state, or even just in a defensive state that they can self-regulate out of. For someone on the spectrum, this is kind of day in, day out, it sounds like, aspects of life. But there are similarities with someone who is in a defensive state. So things like maybe tone of voice, eye contact, socialization, emotional expression, being overwhelmed in social situations, talking over others. But with someone, I think with autism, it's not really an aggressive thing. If you're in flight fight, it's going to be more anxiety ridden or aggressive. And it's more than just like missing social cues. There's aggression to it. There's dominance. That's a part of it. So there are some similarities. Tone of voice. Someone's in a defensive state has less access to their vocal prosody, that sing-songy quality of their voice. So they might have a deeper, I would say maybe more high-pitched voice. Someone who's in like a flight anxiety might have more of a high pitch. But they're going to basically have less vocal prosody. They're going to make less eye contact. They're going to have less socialization while they're in the defensive state. They're going to have less emotional expression. Their affect might even go flat for someone who's just temporarily or even stuck in a defensive state. They might be easily overwhelmed in social situations. They're really not ready to socially engage when we're, down the ladder. And they might talk over others. So that, I wouldn't say it looks like autism, but there are shared similarities with the autism spectrum, but I wouldn't say that it looks like autism. So, are there similarities? Sure. Is it necessarily the same thing as being stuck in a defensive state or even temporarily stuck that you can self-regulate out of? No, I mean, these are like worlds apart, in my opinion. Not just in my opinion. These are worlds apart. But the idea that from Dr. Porges, the explanation, the potential is that the autistic individual or someone on the spectrum, they simply have less capacity to access their ventral state or the ventral safety state, social engagement state. Those pathways are just harder to activate, harder to stay in. It's kind of what I'm gathering. I think that's the basic idea of it. So this person that's on the spectrum, they have much more difficulty with utilizing their ventral vagal safety pathways. It's kind of just less accessible. Porges' safe and sound protocol, the idea is to utilize sound that has more, it's like designed to be, I believe, more prosodic and to quote unquote stimulate the vagus nerve, or at least the safety pathways. It's supposed to stimulate them through sound, which is cues of safety through prosody for any of us will be a cue of safety, which will help us to climb our ladders. So I believe that safe and sound protocol, that's the basic idea. And that's been utilized, I believe, with autism, people on the autism spectrum. And from what Porges reports, there's been a lot of success there. So they have less ability to be in their ventral state. Is it completely gone? I don't know, but it seems like no. It seems like there is some potential there for that individual to have those ventral pathways active and to experience some level of social engagement and connection and safety, at least in that moment. I don't know. I couldn't tell you how long lasting that is, how permanent that is. I don't think it's a issue of a cure or anything like that. Um, but that's the potential connection there. But they're different. They're way different. Autism versus a stuck defensive state or even just a temporary one is very different.